All right. So this is the 13th presentation I've given in 8 days. Where the hell am I again? Right, I knew that part. Everything I'm going to say today I've written and said many times before. You can read about that at Nature Bats Last, my website. You could also read the Reader's Digest condensed version in the book I have coming out November 9th, Walking Away from Empire, which you can also find at my website. If you don't want to buy the book, because it's expensive, because it's a mainstream sort of publisher, then send me an email and you can get my contact information at my website, and I'll send you the page proofs. Now, it's just electronic and they're kind of crappy because there's a bunch of errors in there. Hopefully I cleaned up most of those, but just let me know and I'll send you the free version. I'm speaking for free on this whole tour because I think we're headed for a world in which money doesn't matter. So it doesn't make sense to me to make money while the world burns. I want to talk about durable living and resilient communities in light of the twin sides of the fossil fuel coin. And by that I mean global climate change and energy decline. Global climate change and its implications for humanity, energy decline and its impacts on the industrial economy. And so I want to talk about durable living arrangements in light of that. So this is the outline for where we're going to go today. First, the bad news. We're in the midst of climate chaos. That doesn't really look too bad when you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fourth assessment, which came out in late 2007, in which they forecast a 1 degree C temperature increase, global average for the planet, by 2100. For pointing out the obvious, we were already 3/4 degree C above baseline when this projection came out. Strictly for elucidating the obvious, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which they shared with climate crusader Al Gore. Hadley Center for Meteorological Research comes along with more data and more sophisticated models a year later, and they conclude that we're headed for a 2 degree C temperature increase by 2100. Now that doesn't sound so bad either, right? 2 degrees C? The whole time I've been on this trip, I wish it was 2 degrees C warmer. Because I came from Arizona, it was 108 degrees when I left. I go blowing into the UP, my hosts have the windows open in the bedroom. It's 39 degrees, there's a 30-mile-an-hour wind blowing through there, and I'm thinking, I don't own enough clothes for this trip. But 2 degrees C is actually dire at the level of the planet. 2 degrees C almost certainly kicks into action multiple positive feedbacks, which lead pretty quickly to a 6 degrees C warmer planet. 6 degrees C doesn't sound like all that much either, but the last time the world was 6 degrees C warmer than it is now, or than it was at baseline 150 years ago, there were snakes the size of yellow school buses living in the Amazon, and the largest mammal on the planet was the size of a shrew. That's the largest mammal that can thermoregulate at those temperatures. We, with our big bodies, as mammals, cannot thermoregulate in a much warmer world, a world without ice. United Nations Environment Program comes along again with more data and more sophisticated models, mid-2009, just a few months after the Hadley Center's latest projection, and says we're headed to 3.5 degrees C by 2100. And you can see there's still a lot of room left. So this is not going to turn out well. Usually before I talk, people put money in, and they have two reactions when they leave. They take their money back, or they put in all their money because their money doesn't matter anymore. So they might as well put it in the bucket. Hadley Center for Meteorological Research comes along about a year after their previous assessment and says 4 is the new 2, and it's coming by mid-century. This is truly dire and truly catastrophic, and nobody knows. I mean, 40 of us know now. Notice there's still quite a bit of room left on the board. Just like to point that out every now and then so you can brace yourself for impact. Global Carbon Project and the Copenhagen Diagnosis, in light of the upcoming climate talks in Copenhagen, project 6 and 7 degrees C respectively by 2100, which is consistent with the notion of a 4 degrees C warmer planet by 2060. International Energy Agency says in about a year ago that we're committed to 3.5 degrees C by 2035. Now, if I'm doing my math right, that's only 24 years from now. A single generation of human beings. And this almost certainly leads to 6 degrees C, say by 2050. The news, of course, is so much worse than I've been telling you so far. All of these projections are based on simple linear models. None of them take into account the multiple positive feedbacks likely to kick into play. None of them do. These are all simple linear assessments of business as usual, or what I call disaster as usual, continuing the industrial economy as we have been, but no positive feedbacks kicking into play on the climate front. If we add in those feedbacks, things spin out of control pretty quickly. 16 degrees C temperature increase above baseline by 2100, including the feedbacks. Almost always somebody at this point swears. Like, holy shit. So thank you for your remarkable restraint, or maybe you're just sleeping. Of course it gets worse. According to an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, one of the premier journals in the world when it comes to science, climate change is irreversible over temporal horizons relevant to humanity. So we're at 394 parts per million CO2 right now in the atmosphere, and we will be at 394 parts per million at least for the next 1,000 years.
That's irreversible.
Yes. CO2 in the atmosphere is not easily extracted out of the atmosphere. So once it's up there for a long time. It's very recalcitrant in the atmosphere. So the notion promoted by Bill McGibbon, for example, at 350.org, that we'll get down to 350 parts per million is simply disingenuous. We are not going to see that. Not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime, not in many, many lifetimes to come. United Nations Environment Program points out that during 2008, global carbon emissions increased to their highest level since 1980. That is, since we actually started enforcing the Clean Air Act completely. So you might remember 2008. We called it the Great Recession. It was the most profound economic contraction since we stopped calling them depressions, because that was too depressing. So we call them recessions now. This is the most profound recession since the Great Depression, and global carbon emissions increased to their highest level since 1980, since we started fully implementing the Clean Air Act. Of course, we've set records since then in 2009, 2010. A refereed journal article in the journal Climatic Change says only economic collapse will prevent runaway climate change. That was 2 years ago. And nobody knows. This is among the most important papers I've ever seen and among the least cited in the scientific literature. This paper has been cited 11 times. More than half of them by the author in subsequent papers. I interviewed 8 postdocs for the premier postdoctoral program in the world last January. And of the 8, 6 said they were climate scientists. That was their specialty. So I asked each of the 6 of them about this paper, and none of them had heard of it. These are the people who are at their best in terms of their knowledge of climate science, and none of them had heard of it. Only complete economic collapse will prevent one runaway greenhouse that will commit our species to extinction by mid-century. It seems like that's kind of important to me. A guy named Tim Gannett at the University of Utah. It's in the journal Climatic Change. It came out on November 21st, 2009, about 2 years ago. It was rejected by several scientific journals first because it's just too dire. That can't happen here. But then the prestigious journal Climatic Change says, yeah, it's bulletproof. There's nothing wrong with this analysis at all. And it seems at only 3/4 degree temperature increase, we are starting to see the positive feedbacks kick in. None of these were expected to occur until we hit 2 degrees C above baseline for global average temperature, and we know of 5 so far. One reported in Science earlier this year in January is that the Arctic is defrosting as Atlantic water, warm Atlantic water, is shooting up, and instead of reversing like the thermohaline conveyor belt does when it's behaving, instead of reversing at Greenland, it's shooting through the north and east coast of Greenland, through the Fram Strait, into the Arctic, which was 20 degrees warmer last winter than it's ever been.
20 degrees F?
Yes, 20 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than it's ever been. And from various sources, all within the last few months, we see evidence that the peat in the world's boreal regions is decomposing rapidly enough to be a significant source of carbon into the atmosphere. In addition, you can go to places in Siberia now and light the ground on fire. So methane is coming out so fast. We also have deep water ocean methane hydrates or clathrates being released at an astonishing rate. Methane is 25 to 27 times more powerful a greenhouse gas molecule for molecule than carbon dioxide is. So that's a really big deal. Methane is not as recalcitrant in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide is, but it is far more powerful when it goes up into the atmosphere. It decomposes into relatively stable particles that don't contribute much to global climate change in a relatively short period of time. But it's a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And finally, the Amazonian drought from last summer allowed the Amazon to produce more carbon than the United States, just through decomposition of the forest. Because of this profound drought, the Amazon was producing more carbon than all of our cars combined. And we're number one. And we got aced by the Amazon. We should try harder. Our hope then is that climate chaos will be trumped by complete collapse of the industrial economy. That's the only hope for our species to make it through the global change bottleneck at this point in time. It might be too late. But if we act as if it's too late, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we act as if it's too late and we just keep going along with hedonism as usual, then we're done. Game over. Fortunately, economic collapse is underway and is likely to be complete soon. Societe Generale, large French bank, warns their investors as one of 3 equally weighted forecasts that global economic collapse will be complete within 2 years. That makes it November 2011. That's coming right up. And it could happen. I wouldn't be surprised either way at this point. Societe Generale is joined by 72 writers, pundits, forecasters, who say global economic collapse will be complete not by November 2011. Each of these people think that it's all over by the end of next year, November 2012. So they give us lots of time, maybe too much time. Now, not all of these people are energy literate or know a lot about financial matters. Okay, Tony Robbins is a motivational speaker. How'd you like to go to that deal? I'm Tony Robbins, and I'm here to change your life. Quickly, because we don't have much time. I used this November 2011 number from Societe Generale to point out that in November 2009, they said we might have as little as 2 years left. And so that indicates how quickly things can fall apart on the economic front. This was after the Great Recession was over, according to the economists and politicians. Richard Heinberg is the latest on the list. Richard Heinberg is probably the world's foremost energy scholar at this point, and he produces among the most conservative economic forecasts out there. He's written a handful of books on peak oil and energy decline generally. And 2.5 weeks ago, he said in an interview with James Howard Kunstler that he thought this fall we're headed for a profound economic event that might be the tipping point that takes us under. So, again, it could happen, maybe not. Sorry?
I had read his recent book, The End of Growth, and I was
What he wants me to read.
Right, yeah. You should read End of Growth.
I'll have to read it quick.
You should read Peak Everything. There's lots of things you can read out there that are about this next slide. So in 1956, M. King Hubbert, working as a petroleum geologist for Shell Oil Company, gave a presentation. And he showed the data to the left of the vertical line. This is 1956. These are the data points for U.S. crude oil extraction, which he calls production. But since we aren't actually making it, it seems a little funny to me to call it production. The Earth made it, and we're sucking it out of there. In 1956, M. King Hubbert drew this curve, which I've drawn here in blue, and indicated that based on these data from here back, we were headed for the peak of U.S. crude oil plus condensate extraction in 1970, after which we would see a decline rate similar to the acceleration rate, as it were. Now you'll notice he underestimated the amount of crude oil that was available. That's that dot right there. That's 1970. So he was off by quite a wide margin. But he nailed to the year, 14 years in advance, when the peak would occur. It wasn't completely clear, even in 1971 and 1972, that the U.S. had peaked. Those numbers are statistically very close to the 1970 peak. But by 1973, it was pretty obvious that we were looking at the peak in the rearview mirror. So through 1972, everybody was laughing at M. King Hubbert. Look, they were saying, we're producing more oil than we ever have. Ha ha, you were wrong. And he says, well, that was my point. We're producing more oil than we ever have. That's what the peak means. So this curve has come to be known as Hubbert's peak or Hubbert's curve or peak oil, although it applies to all other finite materials as well. So the same curve, the same relationship applies for uranium. We passed the world peak in 1980. Coal, we're at or near the world peak in coal, and so on. So by 1973, it became clear that the U.S. was headed south in terms of energy production. And we can look at the close-up, and that makes it even more clear. So here's 1970, here's 72, 73. Looks like things are going south. The Energy Information Administration was born in the U.S. Department of Energy. OPEC was born in light of the United States no longer being the swing supplier. The United States took the two political actions that it could take at the time. First, drill, baby, drill. There's Alaska. We brought Alaska online. You see, that worked for a while. Didn't ever exceed the U.S. peak. But it gave us a little bump. And now we're at, what, half, approximately, at this point of the peak. Then we did the other thing that was obviously necessary as well. In addition to drill, baby, drill, we started importing more oil from other countries. In 2008, we were importing 70%, but that's when the U.S. peaked in terms of demand, apparently. So we're now down to about 2/3 of our oil comes from foreign sources. This is a big deal because almost all countries are in decline at this point, are past their peak. And what you see here is what happens to late peaking countries. This is Mexico. They peaked late, so they have lots of technology available to them. So they pump in lots of salt water into the fields so they can get out more oil. The technology allows them to extend the plateau a little longer, but when the decline comes, it's catastrophic. So Mexico is now producing about half as much oil as it was when it peaked in 2004, just 7 years ago. That's our number 2 supplier after Canada. You got to find it before you can suck it out of the ground, and you see the similar kind of curve associated with discovery as you see with extraction. Oil discovery has been declining since 1964, and you can see even when people talk about the big fields, the Jack 2 field in the Gulf of Mexico, that they're really minor relative to what we've seen in the past. One of the problems here is that for the average American, any word that ends with illion is a little confusing. So there's a few illion barrels out there, and we can't really tell the difference between million and billion and trillion. So if you just say something ends with illion, it sounds like a heck of a lot. But actually, at the world level, we burn about 70 million barrels per oil per day. So you better find illions and illions if you're going to keep that game going for very long. So fields like the Jack 2 field, they're good for a month or two at the world level. We haven't nationalized our oil companies in this country. So our oil companies don't sell to us. They sell to the highest bidder. So it's a world market. It's a world predicament. World crude plus condensate peaked in 2005, and we've been on a plateau since then. If we forecast a 4% annual decline rate, which is conservative, after 2009, we see that we have approximately the same oil available to the world in 2025 as we had in 1970, when there were half as many people on the planet and we were far less industrialized. In fact, that 4% decline rate is very conservative. The Energy Information Administration and the US military predict a 5.5% decline rate starting this year. The Iran Foreign Oil Minister predicts a 10% decline. The International Energy Agency, based on two separate analyses, one of the 400 largest oil fields in the world, one of the 800 largest oil fields in the world, predicts a 9.1% annual decline rate. Even a 5.5% annual decline rate, such as proposed by the US military, gets us from here to the 1970 level in 2018, 7 years from now. None of that really matters. What matters to the industrial economy is not that we have nearly 1 trillion barrels left in the ground, but instead, the price of oil. That's key. So here's what happened when we passed the world oil peak in 2005. And I should back up just a little bit. In 2008, January 2008, under the George W. Bush administration, the Energy Information Administration changed how they reported crude plus condensate. So for the first time ever, since 1973, since reporting began, crude plus condensate included one other thing, tar sands. So it wasn't just crude plus condensate, it was crude plus condensate plus tar sands. But it isn't reported that way. It's still reported as crude plus condensate. So according to Energy Information Administration statistics, we peaked in 2008, we peaked again in 2009. That's because all that oil is coming online from our #1 supplier, Canada. You gotta love what we're doing in Edmonton. Those tar sands, that's great stuff there. Requires a huge amount of clean water to destroy every aspect of the living planet, so we can drive around a little bit more. What happens when we peaked is the price of oil responded to that with these fluctuations, and then there was some evidence of economic growth in the world, so the price spiked to $147.27 in July 2008, which, according to Ben Bernanke, nearly terminated Western civilization several times starting in September 2008. So in the wake of that huge spike in the price of oil, demand destruction led to collapse of the oil price down to $32.40 within 6 months, thus destroying all capital along the way. So suddenly, T. Boone Pickens is no longer interested in big wind farms in the Great Plains, because that doesn't work at $100 oil, and it certainly doesn't work at $32 oil. So that's what happens in the wake of peaking, is these spikes. And if the price were to be maintained at $120 or $140 per barrel for an extended period of time, then maybe there would be some prospects for bringing, quote, alternatives into play. Things like the oh so precious tar sands and shale oil and other really horribly nasty things. Again, the price is what matters. Each of the last 6 global recessions was preceded by a spike in the price of oil. That's every recession since 1972. The bigger the spike, the the more profound, the deeper the economic recession. 10 of the past 11 recessions, dating back considerably further than 1972, were preceded by a spike in the price of oil. So it's about the price of oil. That's what's driving this thing. And that's what makes the Societe Generale forecast of global economic collapse by November 2011 seem not that ridiculous. Price spiked to $147.27 in July. That's about 82 euros. Price spiked to $126 this May. That's about 82 euros. Well, what do you know? Europe's on fire financially. The whole thing's coming down. Right? We got Greece being bailed out by Germany, which is being bailed out by France, which is being bailed out by Belgium, which is being bailed out by Spain, which is being bailed out by Italy, which is being bailed out by Greece. But wait, that's where we started. There's this big circular movement of money. It's smoke and mirrors. There's no money. There's no money left to pay off all that debt that these countries are committed to at this point. The U.S. debt officially was $10.5 trillion when Barack Obama took office. It's now $14.7 trillion. 2.5 years, we've added about 50% to the U.S. debt. At $10.5 trillion, that exceeded the value of all the currency in the world combined, plus all the gold in the history of the world ever mined. So obviously we can't pay off a $10.5 trillion debt, so why don't we just print some more money and make it 14.7? But if we add in those things the government actually owes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, quote, entitlements, to which I'm entitled because I paid into the system for 30 years, we add those in, the U.S. debt is $212 trillion. Whoopsie. 212, we get up to a 90 or 100% debt to GDP ratio, and economists start freaking out. What about 2,000%? Sounds like that might be a problem, except that neoclassical economists haven't noticed yet or haven't paid attention. We won't pay that debt. We'll default one way or another. We have to. There's not enough money. We'll either default through money printing so that we have enough money, in which case the dollar becomes worthless. But that requires raising the debt ceiling. Raising the debt ceiling is something we did, what, a month ago? And there's this big political fight about it. And that was supposed to get us through 2013, mid-2013, right, till after the next election's over. Do you know when, at the current rate, we spend our way through the U.S. debt ceiling again? Yeah, that'll be 8 days ago. We already blew through the debt ceiling. Nobody's telling you. The Treasury Department isn't telling you because they crap their pants already and they're looking for mom. I mean, come on. You can't tell people how dire the condition really is. We'll have to go back to the Tea Party and have a little negotiation with them again. And at some point, that's not going to work. So we're going to default, probably suddenly and catastrophically. There's more evidence for energy decline. Joint Operating Environment 2010 put out by the Pentagon says no spare oil capacity by 2012. I suspect that's what drove the spike to $126 in May of this year. And they forecasted 10 million barrel per day gap by 2015. By 2015, so about 3 years from now, we can expect a 10 million barrel per day gap between the 70 million we're burning and producing and extracting now and what we will have then. 10 million barrels per day. Again, we don't know what that means because it ends with an illion, but it's a lot. So at the world level, in terms of crude oil, we burn about 70 million barrels per day. 10 million barrels per day, that's 15%. Doesn't sound like much. Try taking 15% of your blood out. Tell me how that works out for you. I'm guessing you're going to slow down. You might even keel over. Crude oil is the lifeblood of the industrial economy. It might just keel over in the absence of that much oil from the system. Seeing what's coming, the Army Chief of Staff put out a study about a year ago called Unified Quest 2011. And in it, they let us know that they were preparing for large-scale civil unrest in this country and therefore the implementation of martial law. Now, I have no doubt that the U.S. military has been preparing for martial law for a while, but they never told us before in a public document. I don't think it's possible, by the way. Martial law, really? There's what, 24 large-scale military units in the country? Well, no, there's like half that many in the country because half are otherwise occupied. So we got 12 large-scale military units. Okay, that might be enough to corral the people in I don't know, Ann Arbor? What are they going to do out here? Well, there's no way we apply martial law at large scale in this country. It can't work. There's not enough people in the military to shoot the rest of us. Not suggesting that would be a good thing, by the way. Try not to get personal here either.
Certainly not.
So peak oil at some point leads to what I call the Greatest Depression. We will have massive unemployment approaching 100%. But we won't know because the government will cease to exist for all practical purposes, so there will be nobody to report unemployment of 100%, which they would never do anyway because it's already 18% and they're reporting half that number. And so when it's 100%, they're reporting 50, and I don't know who they think is going to have a job at that point to read the newspaper to find out it's 50%. And this is somewhat misleading anyway because nobody's going to be not working, right? Employment will actually be full. We'll all be working. When we don't have energy slaves anymore, we're going to be working really quite hard, or we won't be welcome in our community at all. What we will have, though, is very little crude oil being refined into the distillates, gasoline and diesel, used to power the cars and the trucks. And you've seen the bumper sticker on half the trucks on the highway, right? Without trucks, America stops. That's about right. So without those trucks running around, we don't have food in the grocery store. We don't have fossil fuels being used for air conditioning or heat. We got no water coming out of the municipal taps. We have no Western civilization. I put it in green because it's such happy news for those of us who care about a green and living planet. Another indicator of what good news economic collapse really is the number of species we drive to extinction every day. Currently, that's between 200 and 300 species a day, every single punishing day. So if we keep up the industrial economy for much longer, we're just going to destroy everything we need to survive. Gross domestic product, one macro measure of the economy, tracks pretty close on a one-to-one line with the rate at which we list threatened and endangered species in this country. Now, this only goes to 2000 because in 2000, under the George W. Bush administration, we stopped listing threatened and endangered species, thus looking the other way. But, so that flatlines at 2000, but that's okay because GDP did too. Not surprisingly, according to BP data, we hit the undulating plateau of world oil extraction in 1998. Not surprisingly, we entered an economic recession in 2000. That's when all the economic measures peaked, including stock market indices. So we've been in an economic recession for 11 years. We've been in an economic depression since December 2007. And things are not getting better no matter what they tell you on the television. What we have developed, in other words, in this country is the very antithesis of durable living. We have developed a set of living arrangements, suburbia and the interstate highway system, that demands us to live far from work, far from play, far from the things we need for shopping. We have built the suburban nightmare. The U.S. industrial economy depends upon personal consumption. Some 2/3 to 70% of the economy, as pointed out by economists all the time, is driven by personal consumption. If you don't consume, then the whole thing falls apart. And you look at the definitions of consumption, it doesn't look like it's such a swift thing to me. So go to the mall, support America, do away with completely, destroy, spend wastefully, squander, use up, waste, burn away, perish. God bless America along the way. The antithesis of durable living requires another political response in addition to drill, baby, drill. And that's kill, baby, kill. In 1970, when the U.S. peaked, we didn't even have the world's largest military. That's stunning because now our military is bigger than all the rest of them in the world combined. Because that's what it takes to maintain an empire in decline. What we need from you is obedience at home. What we need abroad is oppression. So we pummel everybody and everything we can find to take what we think we need from every other country. And you better not say anything about it in this country. When I talk to college-age students, I routinely start by talking about resistance. One of the reasons I left the University of Arizona nearly 3 years ago is as an act of resistance against the dominant paradigm that is making us crazy and killing us. And so I talk about how I came of age, I was their age, during an era of resistance in this country. When I was a college-age student, illegal protests against a corrupt dominant paradigm got us out of Vietnam. Illegal protests against the corrupt dominant paradigm got us the environmental legislation that became the envy of the world. Illegal protest against the dominant and corrupt system gave us civil rights legislation that allows colored people to vote in this country. My contemporaries died for those rights. Now you talk about resistance to college-age kids and they think, well, they're going to take away my Facebook page. I can't do any of that shit. So here's resistance in 2000, the US version. 2000, George W. Bush goes around, he speaks to college campuses, and at many of those college campuses, a single lone student would stand up and turn his back in silent protest in expression of his First Amendment rights to freedom of expression. And it wasn't long before other students noticed and they stood up too and turned their back on the future president of the United States in silent protest of what he was saying, expressing their First Amendment rights. Often, by the time George W. Bush was done speaking, there was a quarter to a half of the people in the audience with their backs turned. It was underreported by the media, but it was happening very frequently. So here's resistance, the 2010 version. The 2010 version is Ray McGovern standing in silent protest, turning his back on Hillary Clinton when she's speaking. And Ray McGovern is not joined by anybody in the audience, and he is beaten bloody and hauled to jail by the security detail. Ray McGovern was 71 years old. Ray McGovern prepared the daily intelligence briefing for 4 presidents. He was a known entity, well respected in Washington, D.C. At 71 years old, he stood in silent protest, expressing his First Amendment rights, and he was beat up and hauled to jail. That's what it takes. So that's what we do. The trouble is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. So I saw it, sadly for me. And I couldn't unsee it, much as I would like to most days. So I had to leave an empire in decline as an act of resistance, as a small token of my disgust with the way we live in this country. There's a moral imperative to the way we live our lives. And it has everything to do with those 200 to 300 species we drive to extinction every single day. If we're going to develop a durable set of living arrangements, we must recognize that the industrial economy is a subset of the environment, not the other way around as economists would have you believe. The economists have us believe that we need to have a whole bunch of money, everybody needs to be rich, and then we can start protecting the environment. Yeah, that's been working nicely so far. So instead, what we do is build civilization, which means we drain the country into the city. If we are to live durably, we must use only local materials. We can have no imports, no exports, no cheap plastic crap from China, no bananas from Costa Rica, no out-of-season asparagus from Peru. None of that works if we're going to move beyond brand Earth and beyond globalization that is destroying every aspect of the living planet. We must consume materials at the rate they are produced. Currently, we consume soils, there on the left, clean water, there on the right, and of course fossil fuels at far more rapid rates than they are produced by natural processes. And finally, and importantly, at the local level, we must rely on our local human community for support. In fact, if we are to thrive in the post-carbon era, or I would argue in any era at all, we need to secure our water, secure our food, maintain our body temperature at a safe number, say 98.6 degrees plus or minus, and we must develop a decent human community. A decent and caring human community is fundamental to a durable set of living arrangements. Most people, when I speak, they think, 1, they're shaking their head, 2, yeah, sure, that makes sense, 3, you betcha, and number 4, he's going to say defense. Yeah, bunkers and bullets, that's our answer. And when I say community, and they're thinking defense, I'm thinking the same thing. Community is the best defense. Community is how we get through this. It's how we put our shoulders to the wheel and get through what will be economically challenging times. I don't think that works at the level of large cities. And that's okay with me because large cities are the apex of empire. Large cities require the transport of water and food and clean air into the city and the export out of the city of garbage and pollution. The apex of empire is a really bad idea. You can read about that story in the biblical book of Genesis, by the way. It was Cain who built the world's first cities, after all. Do we have enough leadership to make this work? At the national level and the international level, this is what we're looking at. In the fine print, it says also the bridge is out ahead. So this is our politicians in this country, right? Debt ceiling debacle, Al-Qaeda, look out, the boogeyman is right around the corner. We might have another 9/11 since it's the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And on and on and on. And oh, by the way, we're destroying every aspect of the living planet on which we need to actually survive. We passed a world oil peak a few years ago, so it looks like the industrial economy is circling the drain, tighter and tighter circles. And global climate change threatened to kill us all by mid-century. Or the bridge is out up ahead. The failure of leadership is comprehensive on all of these topics. And that's to be expected because there are no politically viable solutions for any of those topics. You ask the typical American what they want. Do you want to save the environment? Well, sure, yeah, sure, as long as I have a job and I make $100,000 a year and I can always get to Walmart to get my stuff. Then, yeah, sure, then we can protect the environment. But by that time, there's nothing left. What do you think about global climate change? Well, I don't really think about that. That might be a problem. So I'm going to give just a very few examples of how I, in my small human community in a rural area, maintain decent and kind relations with my neighbors. These are so obvious as to be hardly worth mentioning, but I'm a scientist, so I elucidate the obvious all the time. That's what we do. So I'm going to go there. All right. So we have many, many informal social gatherings. No particular the handsome guy there on the left. We have more formal get-togethers as well. In this particular case, we are building the condominiums for river otters that will be reintroduced with luck soon into the last free-flowing river in the state, which lost those river otters in the early 1950s. So we're building the otter pods, the otter boxes, the condominiums for a soft release from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Personally, I think river otters know what they're doing. So I think we should fly over in a helicopter and just dump them into the damn river. What they call a hard release. Only if they bounce. But they're all into this soft release because they are afraid they might offend the otters. They put them in a box, blah, 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 whatever. Anyway, so it gives us an opportunity to work together, shoulders to the wheel, and develop some understanding of who we are and how we might get along when we're working on a project for the common good. At the property I occupy with a small family and their now 8-year-old son, we have a solar array on the roof of the house, and that's a community investment. So that when the grid fails, members in our community will still be able to run small power tools. So that when the grid fails, we can do what we're already doing, which is get the community together and grind our grains and bake our bread together. So what you have here is a grinding mill. It's supposed to be a hand grinding mill, but I ran it like twice, and my bicep was getting too big, and I don't like that asymmetry in my life. So I stopped that and went out and bought a $5 fan belt and an $80 evaporative cooling fan and rigged it up the easy way. So now I run it off the solar panels on the roof. So we can grind the grains and make the bread, and so we fire up the Orno, or the earth oven, and we have a communal bread baking. We can do that now, and it's a great idea, and we can do that in the future as well. We also grind mesquite pods. Mesquite is a native plant species that has these very sweet leguminous pods that we can grind up and turn into a flour. And so we're doing that at relatively large scale for a small homestead.
Is this Arizona?
This is southwestern New Mexico,
Southwestern New Mexico.
not far from Tucson, Arizona. So those are some examples of what we have going on in this little tiny community at the very edge of empire. And what I'm interested in doing is finding out what we can do, what we should do, what we must do in a community like Middleville to get together with our neighbors and prepare for the days ahead. I think perhaps the most important hurdle most people need to leap over is the psychological one. Once you realize that oil is the lifeblood of the world's industrial economy, and the world's industrial economy is killing everything in its path, and that oil is going south, then maybe you'll get together with your neighbors, put your shoulders to the wheel, and start developing a different set of living arrangements. The time to drill a well is not when you're thirsty. The time to plant a garden is not when you're hungry. The time to get together with your neighbors is not after the lights go out. It's now. We have developed frequent opportunities for interaction formally and informally. We have formal events such as this one, which I encourage at every opportunity, but there's also informal interactions that you all can develop. We're about to implement an idea of First Fridays. So at our property, we'll host everybody who wants to come over every first Friday of the month. There's no agenda. There's celery sticks and carrot sticks and cheese and crackers, and it's all low key and low cost, but let's get to know our neighbors a little bit better. Because for one thing, that's a pretty decent way to live, no matter what happens in the future. The time to develop post-carbon infrastructure and implement that is now. You don't want to wait until you don't have access to a monetary system to pay somebody the $3,000 you got burning away in your checking account to drill a well, to deliver water in Middleville, to establish community gardens and start growing in them. It takes a while to figure out how to grow food. I'm such an inspiration, if only to myself. When I started this project, I could barely distinguish between a screwdriver and a zucchini. And that tells you all you need to know about my building skills as well as my growing skills. Now I can actually build things and I can actually grow things. I almost never plant a screwdriver expecting squash to come out. I almost never do that anymore. Occasionally I still do a little backslide. I almost never take a cucumber out on a construction project. Oh, forgot the screwdriver, where'd that go? It takes a while to figure out how to do this. Growing things is not an easy proposition. Building things is an even more challenging proposition when you've spent an entire life in an ivory tower like I have. So let's get going. And let's make it fun. If we can't dance at the revolution, I don't want to be there. So now I'd like to hear from you what you think are some viable, specific strategies that we can pursue as a community to prepare for the days ahead. So that's where I want to go next. I thank you for your rapt attention, and I'll give Aaron a few seconds to change out his tape before we start a broader discussion.